The day my daughter turned 60, I sat alone in my kitchen in Burlington, watching the snow come down outside the window, waiting for a phone call that never came. I had bought a card 3 weeks earlier, one of those simple ones, cream-colored with small forget-me-nots on the front, because forget-me-nots were what we used to plant together every spring along the back fence when she was small. I had written inside it, and sealed it, and set it on the hallway table where I would remember to mail it. I never mailed it, because 2 weeks before her birthday, my daughter Vivian called me and said, very calmly, very reasonably, the way she had learned to say everything in the past year and a half, that it would be better if I didn't reach out for a while. Joel and I need space, Mom. We need to figure out what our family looks like without the tension. I asked her what tension she meant. She paused, and in that pause I heard someone else's words being sorted through, chosen carefully, handed to her like a script. You know what tension, she said. You've always known. I did not know, but I was beginning to understand who did. My name is Irene, and I am going to tell you something that took me 2 years, one very good solicitor, and a manila envelope sitting in a locked filing cabinet to finally be able to say out loud. I am not a woman who dramatizes. I am not a woman who performs grief for an audience or who mistakes loudness for strength. I taught high school English for 31 years in the same town where I was born, and I have seen enough of human nature in a classroom to know that the people who talk the most are rarely the ones worth listening to. So when I tell you what happened, I need you to understand who I was before any of it. I was the person who showed up. Not perfectly, not without making mistakes, but steadily and honestly and with everything I had. I raised Vivian mostly on my own after her father, Douglas, left when she was 9. Not a dramatic leaving. No affair, no scene. Just a slow withdrawal from a life he had decided no longer fit him, ending in a conversation at the kitchen table that I have never fully described to anyone, including Vivian. I protected her from that. I probably protected her from too much. Douglas moved to Vancouver and eventually remarried. He and Vivian had a cordial relationship. The kind where birthday cards arrived on time. But nothing harder than that was ever asked of either of them. I was the one who drove her to every rehearsal, every appointment, every bad decision. She needed someone to sit beside her through. I was the one who flew to Halifax when her first serious relationship ended at 24, and she couldn't get out of bed. I was the one who lent her money for her first apartment and then told her to keep it. Not because I had so much to spare, but because I had enough, and she needed it. When she met Joel, I wanted to like him. I genuinely tried. He was from Calgary, transplanted to Burlington for work, good-looking in an effortful way. The kind of man who makes strong eye contact a little too deliberately, like he had read somewhere that it builds trust. He was attentive to Vivian in public. He remembered details. He asked the right questions. But here is what I noticed, and what I told myself not to make too much of, at least not at first. When Vivian spoke about her childhood, Joel listened in a particular way. Not the way you listen when you are interested. The way you listen when you are filing information. When she talked about the house I still lived in. The same house I'd bought with Douglas in 1987, on a street that had become considerably more valuable than anyone had predicted. Joel's attention sharpened in a way that his face almost managed to hide. The first time he came to dinner, he walked through the main floor the way you walk through a property you are considering making an offer on. He complimented the original hardwood floors. He asked, very naturally, very conversationally, whether I had ever had the place appraised recently, given how the market had moved. He asked whether I found it difficult to maintain on my own. I said I managed fine. He said he was sure I did. Vivian didn't notice. Or maybe she did and told herself it was nothing. That is the thing about people who are good at this. They make their maneuvering look like interest. They make calculation look like care. Over the following months, I started to notice the changes in Vivian. The way you notice weather shifting. Not one dramatic moment, but a series of small signals that you keep explaining away until you can't anymore. She stopped calling on Sunday evenings. Sunday evenings had been ours for 15 years, a habit that had outlasted her university years, her first job, her move across town. Then one Sunday she didn't call, and when I mentioned it the following week, she said she hadn't realized it was a standing thing. She started arriving late to family dinners and leaving early. She started answering my texts in short fragments, when she answered at all. And slowly, the way water shapes stone, certain phrases began appearing in our conversations that I recognized didn't come from her. Joel feels like you have a lot of opinions about our choices. Joel thinks you might not be aware of how much pressure you put on people. Joel mentioned that maybe some of the patterns in our family aren't as healthy as we think. I am a woman who taught literature for 3 decades. I know what it sounds like when a person is reading from a text that isn't theirs. I said nothing. I kept showing up. I invited them to things and did not comment when they canceled. I sent birthday messages and did not follow up when they went unacknowledged. I was not performing patience. I was buying time, though I didn't fully know it yet. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after Joel and Vivian got engaged. They came to the house together, which was unusual. Joel almost never came without being invited to a specific occasion. They sat across from me in my living room, and Vivian held a folder on her lap, and I understood before anyone spoke that this had been rehearsed. Joel began. He said that they had been thinking about the future, about what made sense practically, about what was fair to everyone. He said that Vivian had grown up in this house and had an emotional connection to it, and that it seemed a shame for a house this size to be occupied by one person, when they were renting and trying to build something together. He said it would make sense, practically and emotionally, for me to consider a transition, something smaller, something that would free up capital and allow everyone to benefit. He used the phrase, allow everyone to benefit, twice. Vivian looked at the folder. I looked at my daughter. My daughter, who had learned to read in the chair 6 feet from where she was now sitting, who had come home from her first heartbreak, and pressed her face into the couch cushions, and sobbed until there was nothing left. And I asked her one question. Is this what you want, Vivian? Not what makes sense. What do you want? She looked at Joel before she answered. She looked at him the way someone looks at a prompter standing in the wings. I want what's best for our future, she said. That was not an answer, but it was all I needed to hear. I told them I would need time to think. I offered them tea. I walked them to the door, and I stood in the doorway and watched their car pull out of the driveway. And then I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my solicitor. Her name was Patricia Ossie, and she had handled my affairs for 11 years, which meant she already knew a significant amount about what there was to know. I explained what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment and then she, Irene, what do you want to do? I told her I wanted to be very careful, very quiet and very thorough, she said. Good. Then let's start. What happened over the next 7 months I did methodically and without panic and within every boundary of the law. Patricia connected me with a firm that conducted background investigations, the kind that pull from public records and court databases and sources that are available to anyone who knows where to look and has the patience to look properly. What came back was not what I had imagined, because I hadn't let myself imagine anything specific. I had only let myself pay attention. Joel Haverstock. And that was his legal name, though he had gone by a preferred shortened version in every context I had known him. Had a financial history that explained a great deal. He had been party to a civil dispute in Alberta 6 years earlier. The details, accessible through public court records, described a situation involving an older woman, a piece of property, a relationship of approximately 2 years, and an allegation of undue influence in the signing of a document. The matter had settled before going to full trial. Joel had relocated to Ontario within 8 months of the settlement. There was more. A credit history showing a pattern of accumulating debt within relationships and restructuring it in ways that created obligations for the other person. A business venture that had dissolved with a former partner who had filed a complaint that was later withdrawn. Not a criminal record. Nothing so clean or so obvious as that, just a pattern. The kind that only becomes visible when you lay the pieces side by side. Patricia's team also reviewed the documents Joel had brought to my living room. The ones in the folder Vivian never opened in front of me, through proper channels. We established that the language in those documents, had I signed them, would have created what Patricia described as a revocable license to occupy, rather than true ownership transfer, a structure that would have left me with fewer protections than I currently held. as the registered owner of the property, outright. He had been thorough. I had to give him that. The documents were professionally drafted. He had paid someone to write them correctly. He had just counted on me not having anyone to read them carefully. I also had a phone call with Vivian in late September, which I recorded with her knowledge. I told her at the start of the call that I was recording for my own notes, which is legal in Ontario under single-party consent rules. In that call, several things were said about the property, about my intentions, about my financial situation, that were factually incorrect in ways that mattered. I did not correct them in the moment. I let her speak. I listened to what had been put into her head, and by the end of the call, I had a very clear picture of what had been told to her, and how long it had been going on. By the time Vivian's 60th birthday arrived, I had a gray binder, a USB drive, a signed affidavit from Patricia's investigator, and a conversation with Patricia that ended with her saying, "You're protected, completely." I sat in my kitchen, and I watched the snow, and I did not call Vivian. I did not send the card with the forget-me-nots. What I sent was a single email, forwarded from Patricia's office at 4:47 in the afternoon, while Vivian and Joel were at the restaurant he had booked for her birthday dinner. The email contained 3 attachments. The first was a summary of the background investigation, including the Alberta court record, the financial history, the dissolved business dispute, and a chronological account of the document scheme, cross-referenced with the paperwork Joel had brought to my house. The second was a transcript of our September phone call, with the relevant portions marked and annotated by Patricia, showing the specific inaccuracies and how they mapped onto the property transfer Joel had been working toward. The third was a letter from Patricia's office, explaining that the property had been placed into a trust, with conditions that I had determined, that no transfer or encumbrance of any kind could occur without my explicit written instruction, and that any legal action brought against the trust would be defended using documentation that had already been collected and preserved. It was not a threat, it was information. Clean, complete, and carefully assembled. I know what happened at that restaurant because Vivian called me from the parking lot at 6:58. I could hear the cold in her voice. The February cold that gets into your bones in Burlington when you've been standing outside without your coat on. She didn't speak for a moment after I picked up. Then she said his name. Just his name twice. Then she said, "Mom, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She asked me how long I had known. I said, "Long enough to do something about it before it mattered." There was a long silence, and then she said, "He's saying you're lying. He's saying the records are misrepresented." I said, "Patricia can walk you through everything whenever you're ready. There's nothing in that email that isn't documentable." She started to cry. Not the quiet kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than embarrassment. Somewhere closer to the feeling of having been hollowed out by a version of reality that turned out to be a construction someone else built for you, brick by careful brick, she said. "How did I not see it?" I said. "Because he was very good at making sure you didn't need to." She drove to my house that night. She left the restaurant without finishing the dinner, without, as far as I know, much of a conversation with Joel at all. She arrived at my door at 8:30 with her coat buttoned wrong, and her mascara not so much smeared as simply absent, scrubbed away with the back of her hand in the car. I made tea. That is what I do. I made tea, and I set out the shortbread she has liked since she was 7, the kind with the chocolate on the bottom, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me everything. She told me how it had started. Not with anything she could point to as wrong, but with a slow shift in how she saw things. Joel had a way of framing conversations that made her feel as though she was finally understanding something she'd been missing. Not that I was a bad mother. Nothing so blunt. Just that perhaps I was more complicated than she'd given herself permission to acknowledge. That my love had edges to it. That my presence in her life created a kind of pressure she'd been absorbing. For so long she'd mistaken it for normal. He had never said I was the problem. He had just consistently offered her a version of our relationship in which she was carrying something unfair. And had been for years. And in which his role was simply to help her see it clearly. That is the part that took her the longest to say out loud, I think. Not the property scheme. That, once laid in front of her plainly, was simply what it was. The harder thing was the realization that she had allowed herself to see me through someone else's eyes for a year and a half, and had not questioned it, because it had felt, at the time, like clarity. It is a terrible thing to have that feeling described to you by your own daughter. And also, somehow, one of the more honest conversations we have ever had. She stayed until almost midnight. At some point we stopped talking about Joel, and started talking about other things. Her father, which we rarely did. And things from when she was small that she remembered differently than I did. And a trip we had taken to Cape Breton when she was 11. That neither of us had thought about in years. The kind of conversation that only happens when the performing stops, and two people just sit with what is actually true. Before she left, she stood in my hallway with her coat on correctly this time. And she looked at me for a moment in a way I recognized. She looked at me the way she had looked at me when she was 5, and had done something that required a difficult admission and was bracing for what came next. She said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say it. I'm just sorry." I said, I know you are." I did not tell her it was all right, because it hadn't entirely been. But I also did not need her to earn her way back to me. She was my daughter, and whatever mistakes she had been made inside a fog that someone had deliberately created. You can be angry at a person, and still understand that they were maneuvered. In the months that followed, the practical pieces resolved themselves the way practical pieces tend to when they have been properly prepared. Joel retained a lawyer, and made an initial claim asserting that certain conversations had constituted promises regarding the property. Patricia's documentation was thorough enough that his lawyer contacted her twice, and then went quiet. The claim was withdrawn without proceeding to a hearing. Joel moved out of the apartment he and Vivian had shared within 6 weeks of her birthday and relocated. Calgary again, as it happened. Vivian began seeing a therapist, which was not something I suggested, and not something I would have suggested, because it was not my place. But which I was glad to know about when she told me. She said the therapist had described what had happened as a recognizable pattern, that there were people who were skilled at creating what she called a closed information environment, a relationship architecture, in which the target slowly loses access to perspectives other than the one being provided. It had a name. Several names, actually. Vivian said knowing the name helped her be less ashamed of not having seen it sooner. She started calling on Sunday evenings again. Not right away. There was a period of adjustment, careful and a little formal at first, neither of us quite sure how to step back into rhythms that had been interrupted. But by spring, we were back. Not performing normal. Actually normal, which is rougher around the edges and more honest and considerably better. One Sunday in May, she came over to help me plant along the back fence. She had gone out and bought forget-me-nots. I didn't say anything about the card I had never mailed. I just handed her a trowel and we got to work. At some point she sat back on her heels and looked at the garden and said, "I don't know how you held it together. I would have called me screaming." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Screaming doesn't build anything. It just makes a lot of noise." She smiled at that, a real smile, the one I have known since she was 2 days old. She said, "Patricia said you were the calmest client she had ever worked with." I said, "Patricia is very kind." Vivian said she wasn't being kind. She was being accurate. I am not telling this story because I handled it perfectly. I didn't. There were months when I second-guessed myself. When I wondered if I was seeing patterns that weren't there. When I almost picked up the phone and said something that would have warned Joel he was being watched, and given him time to prepare. There were nights when I sat in this house alone, and felt something that isn't quite grief, but lives right beside it. The feeling of watching your child look through you, as though you are a problem to be managed. I am telling it because of something Vivian said to me on that Sunday in May, after the forget-me-nots were planted, and we were sitting on the back steps with our tea. She said, "Did you ever doubt it? That it would come out right in the end?" I thought about that honestly. The honest answer was yes. There had been moments of real doubt, moments when the distance between us felt permanent. But I said what was also true, which was this. I didn't let the doubt make my decisions for me. She nodded slowly, then she said, "I keep thinking about what he probably thought when he saw that email. He probably thought you had no idea. He probably thought you were just a retired teacher in a house too big for her." I said, Most people see what they expect to see. She looked at me. What did he expect to see? I said, someone who wasn't paying attention. She was quiet for a moment, and the May light came through the maple at the back of the yard, and the forget-me-nots were very small and very blue against the dark soil, and she said softly, he was so wrong. Yes, he was. If you are watching this and something in it feels familiar, not the exact details, but the feeling underneath. The feeling of being slowly moved to the edges of someone's life, while someone else rearranges the furniture of their mind. I want to say this directly. You are not imagining it, and you do not need to make noise to protect what matters. You need to be still and clear and patient and thorough, and you need to trust that the truth does not expire. It waits. It waits for exactly the right moment. The quietest thing I ever did was the most powerful thing I ever did. And Joel Haverstock is back in Calgary, and my daughter is sitting on my back steps drinking tea, and the forget-me-nots are coming up along the fence just the same as always. This is Lyra Payback. I'll see you in the next one.